Hello and welcome to Reimagining Cyber. I'm Rob Aragao, and if you listened to last week's episode, you would have heard me speaking to Craig Jones, the most recent director of the Global Cybercrimes Directorate at Interpol. Craig explained how Interpol connects to various international police forces and collaborate through cybercrime operations, the challenges of dealing with borderless cybercrime, and the critical roles of cyber resiliency in protecting organizations, a subject very close to my heart. But before we knew it, we were out of time, and there were still so many more questions I wanted to ask of Craig. So Craig was so kind to come back on and join us for a second week running. Craig, thanks so much for joining me again.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. It's really good to be back with you on a second episode. Looking forward to our discussion.
Let's continue our conversation and look at the countries that are most targeted for cybercrimes, as well as who the perpetrators are that you're most concerned about.
Let's break this down then. So we look at, victims first of all. Where are you more likely to be a victim of cybercrime? I think you're more likely to be a victim of cybercrime in a country or an economy which is more digitally advanced effectively. So historically, we can look at the West in that. So this is the ransomware piece we have coming out time and time again, and the business email compromise. So the cyber criminals will look at that financial side of things. So that's probably more in the English-speaking sort of West, where you've got a combination of those sort of frauds as well as those technical attacks. So in the technical side, they go after vulnerabilities, and the frauds, they go after, the opportunities to engage on a one-to-one basis, or do a volume and then narrow it down and do those sort of business email compromise. So we're seeing it more and less. You then look at where's the infrastructure base. Well, the infrastructure is everywhere. So that's one of the big challenges we have is, the infrastructure is used by the cyber criminals and used by everybody else as well. So how do you identify that infrastructure and then get that taken down? So I think there's a technical aspect to this, which we could be better at. But then you come into those, let's call them hard to reach jurisdictions. And probably best for me to talk about some sort of examples here when we look at that. We see about the cyber attacks that are reported emanating from Iran, or emanating from the African subcontinent, or emanating from the Far East, or emanating from Russian-speaking countries as well. So you've got those same countries coming up time and time again, and you've got then that piece, whether it's a state act, whether it's a near-state actor, and these are sorted in the cybercrime space. And I should add here, North Korea is not a member of Interpol, so we don't have reach into or with North Korea effectively. And so some of the examples I'll give in that is the way law enforcement is trying to operate now. And we have seen some good examples where we've seen cooperation between the US and Russia, Colonial Pipeline. We've seen sometimes there has been that cooperation and some arrests have been made. But I think if you looked at a clear global graphic about where the main ransomware attacks are happening, there's not many happening in sort of Eastern Europe, Russia, those sort of countries. So I think, it doesn't take a particularly savvy analyst to work out, maybe quite a few of the attacks are coming, or cybercrime is emanating from that region effectively. I think also I'd sort of mentioned Africa in that as well. What we're seeing is where you have economies that are growing really, really quickly. In Africa, you've got a lot of people, it's more on the micro side, so using their mobile phones to conduct their businesses, sharing mobile phones between each other's, swapping SIM cards in and out. That's potentially more vulnerable. But then you look at, crime emanating, let's say Nigeria, for example. There is an organized crime network in sort of Africa, whether you call it Black Axe, which is a wider organized crime group, or whether you look at some of the smaller villages. And we've seen here where you've got extreme poverty in that country. There's an opportunity for them to make money through committing cybercrime. If it works, they're going to do it. So that very similar to Eastern Europe, where we had the villages in Eastern Europe were identified back, the 90s, early 2000s, where you had a whole community there committing cybercrime. So it is a global challenge, as we know, where and how we then take the prevention piece in there, or we take the operational piece. We've seen some really good coordination in Africa recently, and that partly stems from us as Interpol setting a desk up So 2019, it was my first regional cybercrime working group meeting in Africa. I was in a classroom in Nairobi in a police training school. And there's probably about 15 people sat around the table. And we were talking about the challenge that they were faced. And I think it was someone from Dhaka said they'd done a raid recently in a house. And they thought it was human trafficking going on, people being put through that house. But actually, when they went through the door, it was effectively an online cybercrime farm. So you had people sat there behind screens committing cybercrime. They didn't know what to do. They didn't have that capability or that capacity. Now, that's 2019. So fast forward during COVID, and we've seen what's happening now. Currently, we're seeing cybercrime groups who are emanating from the Far East. They're setting up, very large cybercrime centers, let's call them, in the Far East. They're attracting people saying, oh, here's some jobs, come and work for us. And it's a good IT job. You've got people going there. They're then met at the airport, passports taken off from them, and bang, they're almost, it's that modern human slavery effectively in that digital space. So we've seen that come through. But in Africa, as a result of that, we decided then to let's set up a regional operational desk. And by that, we looked in our 4 regional bureaus in Africa, which are spread out sort of northeast, south, and west. So we could place staff in those regional bureaus. We then put threat intel piece into Singapore, which is where we run the main center from effectively, work with the private sector. And in recent years, we've carried out multiple operations, either targeting specific organized crime groups, especially in Nigeria. And, I used to say to Mr. Uchi, I'm really sorry, we're going after these criminals. No, Craig, we know we've got criminals. We want to demonstrate to the world that we are disrupting cyber criminals in this country. So that was going after the people. But also then there's the infrastructure side of that. So we created a framework. So I said previously about the processes. We created a framework, but on the top of that framework for doing cybercrime operations in Africa with the countries, in 2022 in Rwanda, we had 40 plus countries agreeing to that framework with Interpol, the Africa Union. So we got buy-in from those regional entities as well. And that's really, really important. We then signed the framework off, but at the same time, we trained staff there for what we call the surge operation. So what we looked at there is we provided secure platforms for them to come onto. So let's remember the countries here, some of them don't even have ways of communicating. So we were able to then provide them with secure Interpol platforms, and we could put the data on there. And that was looking at compromised infrastructure on ISPs within those countries. And we then analysed the legislation in that country. So within our team and working with those countries, so look, this is your legislation. Under that legislation, they are potentially committing an offence by hosting that on their infrastructure in the ISP, or the terms and conditions which the customer, i.e. the cyber criminals, have signed up to, is being breached. So you can take that down. Last 3 years now, we have maintained that work and that surge operation within Africa. So what we're doing there effectively is we're going in and giving some training. But on the back of that training, there always has to be an operational outcome. I think, you look at some organizations that do a lot of training, but how do you then back up that with operational activities? Trust me, as a law enforcement official, we all love doing a nice course for a week and getting tea and biscuits and a certificate at the end of that course. But then you need to use that. Now, what we can then do, we can then plug that desk into those countries that do have those capabilities or are able to identify the victims. And then they can share that victim data into Nigeria. So then Nigeria can do that prosecution. So coming back to your point there about where are the cyber criminals emanating from, what we should be able to do is use the processes that Interpol have put in place, which I spoke about, those sort of operations. And then when the FBI unseal indictment on 3 Iranian cyber criminals and say, these are 3 Iranian cyber criminals that are committing crime globally, ransomware, etc., but also they're committing crime in Iran. I should then be able to speak with the FBI and say, right, FBI, how can Interpol support you in that investigation? Because you've got the evidence. How can we now take that into Iran and go after the cyber criminals? My language here is very clear. Criminals. Not talking about the countries, not talking about the politics side of it. Push that to one side. But that's where law enforcement is maturing, but we're not doing it quickly enough effectively, because what is happening is, it's like anything. The criminals will take the path of least resistance. They will go where we may not get caught. They may go where it's easier for them to operate effectively. So investing everything in one country is not always the answer. And I'm not saying Interpol's a perfect solution, far from it. It is a lever that can be used by all 196 member countries effectively.
No, and that's excellent. Now, one of the things you discussed briefly, I wanted to delve in a little bit deeper, is the issue around jurisdiction. You talked about it as it relates to, hosting centers, and, an organization may operate out of one particular country. The reality, though, is that it's traversing different ISPs to get to wherever the infrastructure resides. How do you, well, I guess maybe I may ask it this way. What are the common issues you've come across in dealing with jurisdiction?
So I think, let's put the geopolitics on the table to start with. The countries will not cooperate directly between themselves because of the governmental challenges, things like that. So that's one part of the challenge within this. I think also it's how do you regulate, or how do you address a global problem through global regulation? Because that's one way that you have to do it. So do you do that through the prevention and resilience piece? Absolutely. That should be the first piece we're doing, totally, is about how do we make it more resilient? And I think maybe we've all got a little bit too used to the speed of the internet, being able to get on and use things more effectively. We don't want to be bothered with that security nonsense. Someone else does that. So how do we put that more in the background that doesn't harm the user experience, but makes them more secure?
Embedded into it. Yeah, absolutely.
And that's one side. The second side is, okay, well, on a regional basis, where can we do this more effectively regionally? So where's that political will regionally? So looking at through that political lens of the European Union. The European Union has 27 plus countries as part of that European plus like-minded countries. So you've got one body there. So that's one area. Look at it. If you look at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that's a huge regional entity. Russia, China, India, Pakistan, lots of people within, in terms of population size within there. So how can you pull on those different regional entities on the prevention piece, but then also how can you pull that into the operational piece as well? Now, we know some of these cybercrime investigations can take 3, 4, 5 years. That's too long, effectively. And a lot of that is because of those cross-jurisdictional issues. So piece of work has just been completed at the United Nations. It was kicked off by Russia, actually, probably about 2019-20. And what was that looking at was a new international convention to counter the use of information and communications technology for criminal purposes. It's been known as the Ad Hoc Committee for Cybercrime, effectively. Now, from a law enforcement point of view, that's really important, because what that was looking to do was provide a new international convention for cybercrime. So having some common language in there. So coming back to my point, well, this is cybercrime in one country, it needs to be a cybercrime in another country.
Right.
That piece of work was just signed off at the United Nations, that convention, back at beginning of August, actually. Okay. That'll go to the United Nations General Assembly to be voted on. And then what happened then is the countries should ratify that in the coming years. So again, that's putting some of that process. It's boring. I know that. For some people, they'll look at it, but
it's needed.
We need that in there first of all, because if you don't have that common language, that now gave me an opportunity when I went into Russia and spoke in Moscow to a number of senior people in Russia about that. They said, Interpol, you have to agree that our convention is the correct. And I was able to say, no, I don't have to agree. I work for 195 other countries, and that process will go through United Nations. I recognize what you're saying. I recognize there's a need for that, but there's a different body that will go through effectively. So once you have these things in place, once you start shining the light on where the cyber criminals are, you can then start putting the pressure, for want of a better word, for those jurisdictions to deal with it effectively. But again, we're always going to have, one country will say, oh, that's white. Another country will say, well, no, that's black. So you're going to have those differences. I think what we do is we build this out through user case examples. So we talked briefly about Africa and that regional desk we've got there. We've set one up in Asia and South Pacific now. So we're looking at, okay, what's going on in that region at the moment? Now, that's more of a hybrid type thing where you've got people in or being held against their will or committing crime in these not call centers, digital centers. We used to have the call centers emanating from India, and they did a lot of work in that space. So, the mobility of the criminals, we need to make sure we're as mobile and we can do that disruption as well. But we've seen some great examples just recently where we saw sort of some malware which was developed in Brazil, affected by cyber criminals in Brazil, and then was impacting into Spain, into the banking system in Spain. So we were able to work with Brazil, with Spain and some other countries on that. And I think around about March time, it's a 2-year-old investigations, a number of arrests were made. And what happened there is you had Spanish officers and Interpol officers going to Brazil. Now, they don't have the right to arrest, but what they can do is act as that trusted advisor on the ground and reach back into their country very, very quickly. So that model of policing around making sure that the on-the-ground support is there when the criminals are being arrested or the infrastructure is being taken down is absolutely crucial. And we've also seen this in things such as the Olympics and the World Cup, where Interpol can bring together the private sector, the government, law enforcement into, if you like, one operating space when there is one major event to help make that more resilient as well. It comes back to your point, Seb, being able to share that information in real time, making sure that gets to the right people so they can take the right steps and measures to either shut that vulnerability down or disconnect effectively.
Those are great examples, by the way, Craig, for actually kind of, again, putting the light on the reality of what you've seen out there transpire in that regard. What I wanted to do is start transitioning now into the recommendations coming out of Interpol. How to best deal with different types of cyber crimes and prevent them ultimately, but also maybe amplify a little bit on detection and prevention. So, what are some of the kind of guiding principles around detection? And then also the disruption aspect as it relates to judicial outcomes. So do we really go after this thing because we feel we're going to be in a good shape to be able to actually prosecute or not? How do you kind of gauge that? So maybe, again, overarching, what are some of the common recommendations that are coming out of Interpol?
So I think we did a piece on ransomware. I want to say it was during COVID, because I remember it was very late in the evening, and we ran a sort of a global workshop on ransomware. So we had, well over 500 people on that global workshop looking at that ransomware. And one of the parts we looked at there was how do we prevent it? And, a lot of the onus here is around that, coming back to that resiliency piece, what is it that we're trying to protect? So being able to identify what's within a company or within a government agency or as an individual. So first of all, having that awareness. We've seen, and I'll use the UK as an example here, the first one, we had a thing called Cyber Essentials, which looked at what are the essentials that you need. And we were focusing there on small, medium enterprises. So you almost had a big gap here. You had large corporations, organizations that had money but could afford that protection and buy that in. You had the people at the bottom layer there, but if they were going to become a victim of cybercrime, on a volume side of thing, there'll be an impact. But actually, the middle tier, those sort of small, medium enterprises, they were the ones that were particularly vulnerable, because you've got small, agile startups or companies that are part of that supply chain. How do you make them more resilient to a cyber attack? So where do you do that? So you start off with that simple advice. So those campaigns. How do you draw them in? So it's almost like any business. You have to identify the market and how you're going to get into that market. One of the ways the UK did it, they set up cyber resiliency centres, CRCs. And in fact, I'm heading up to a conference this afternoon in Aberdeen, where we're bringing everybody back together to work through that. It's actually a global conference, but the centre there brought together law enforcement, small media enterprises. So, those trade industrial bodies that represented small businesses all came together, and also universities where you had students that are doing cybersecurity degrees or computer science degrees. So what was able to be brought together there was, well, this is the problem we're trying to address. How do we make businesses more secure? Here's the businesses, and here's the future that are looking to address that. So bringing that all together. So As a law enforcement, you're looking to help protect. Then as the industry, you want to make yourself more resilient. And then as the sort of student, you're able to come in, and whether you're doing a project, pro bono or something like that for a business, you're able to get that experience. So you have to start on that small scale. You can't do this on a volume piece to start with. It's really, really hard. When you look in the US at the moment, I'd call it security by default, but how do you build in that security at the very start when you're writing your program?
Yes, absolutely.
How do you put that in there where the user's not interested? The user does not worry too much about what they're doing. They just want to be able to get online. They want to be able to use that service, that software, that app. How do you make that more secure effectively? And we've seen that amplified out from the US out into the Far East in Singapore. You've got a number of countries, you've got a number of companies signing up to this, secure software effectively. I probably haven't got the wording right, but, it's coming back to those core principles. How do you do that prevention side? We at Interpol, we've run global awareness campaigns. So, one click was one of the ones we use. So making people think about, when you are clicking, that you are one click away from potentially becoming a cybercrime victim effectively. So you've got many different avenues, but I think for me, it should be more in the background. So the user experience is there, which you want them to have. And whose responsibility? It's all of our responsibility. We know that, whether it's the user, whether it's a cybersecurity company, whether it's the government, we all have that responsibility. I know when I was in Singapore, for example, I could walk through the Botanic Gardens at 1 o'clock in the morning. I could walk down and I knew I was in a very safe country. That's just an example. In a physical sense, because of the security levels that were put in there and the environment that I was. In the online space, it's slightly different, isn't it?
It is.
You've got people maybe take a more relaxed, risk-based approach. I'm again thinking of my words here, onto different sites they'll go on to, what they would download. And cyber criminals will look at, okay, well, if you're going to download this app so you can watch Premier League football for free, we're going to put something on there.
That's right.
So again, it's that understanding within that space. And I'll only mention AI once, but this is where we're going now, where we have this real change coming and is going on at the moment. So in the cybersecurity space, how AI can be used more effectively to protect us, but then the criminals are looking at it as well. So we won't go down that route now because we'll be here for probably a week talking about it. But, there is always something around the corner.
Yeah, and there always is. And we've I'm not going to shock you by this, but we've had plenty of discussions on the podcast on AI.
I know you have, yeah.
And there's no question that, the cyber criminals, the bad guys are absolutely, no question, again, leading the way. You mentioned a couple things in your response to my question that I do want to call out because they're so critical. The core principle, which I've been driving at for such a long time too, which is the aspect of security absolutely needs to be embedded in, right? It's all about the experience. How seamless can that experience be? Not having the end user look for the loopholes because they're so sick and tired of how difficult it is from a security perspective, right? And that really drives back into the secure by design principles, as you were discussing. The other thing you were alluding to was more of SBOM, software bill of materials, right? So we've been pushing hard on the need for that kind of the ingredient label, if you will, when you go and take a look at something in a grocery store, as an example, kind of that keeps it really simple. So all really important aspects of, again, just making security that much more easier, but absolutely baked in at the very onset of any sort of program.
And I think just picking up that word security, and I think, we're guilty of this. So we talk about cybersecurity, we talk about technology. For some people, they switch off straight away. As soon as you hear that, they switch off. So how can we use this language? How can we make it more relatable to that end consumer? IoT. Okay, well, how do you know what you're plugging into? How do you know whether that's secure or not? Well, they shouldn't really have to worry about that too much, really. Absolutely. They want to be able to, have a system where they can, if they want to, log in and see what's in their fridge. I don't know why someone would want to do that, but I'm sure there are some that do. But there's, again, I think quite often what happens is we develop technology very quickly, and then we look for a user case about how we can use it rather than doing the other way around. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen, far from it. But I think actually we create things sometimes and think, oh, we can use it there. Oh, that's not actually what it was designed for. But you know what? If that works, yeah, let's adapt it and put it in there. And with a couple of tweaks, but I'm doing those tweaks now, that now introducing vulnerabilities into it as well. So yeah, it's the whole ecosystem. But again, I'll just transfer that back into the physical sense. When we first had cars, this is going to be terrible. The cars will be terrible. We then had brakes were developed because cars were going too fast. Then we had seat belts. Unfortunately, there are still accidents that happen. My son yesterday, bless him, managed to have an accident in his own car.
There you go.
This happens. But I think what happens in that cyberspace when we do have these, let's call them accidents, the amplification of those accidents are massive because, whether it's a cyber criminal or whether it's a faulty software release or something like that can have big ramifications.
Right.
And all of a sudden, bang, that is out there and everybody is aware of it.
And it's a great analogy, right? It's that minimizing the impact, right? It's about safety. So as these accidents will continue to happen, of course, but the key is that we're making it safer. We're minimizing the impact. It's the same as you're calling out translation into the cybersecurity world. And again, those analogies, I think it's what's critical when we have these conversations, especially at the business level. So I want to pivot into kind of this, what I like to call, the crystal ball, if you will, Craig. Look at the future, right? And so, again, you've just transitioned away from your role at Interpol and running the cybercrimes program. Tons and tons of great evolution of the program that you and your team have put in place. You're leaving, I think, the incoming team members in a great spot. What's next? What's desired? What's part of that? Here's what you wanted to accomplish and kind of what you're also seeing, the greater of Interpol to become.
Yeah. I think for me, I'm a program manager as well. So I came in to take on the program and basically crash the program and rebuild it. So the first part was to make Interpol more operationally relevant. So it's not saying we're going to lead the operations. So identification of threat, as I came back to at the start, threat, risk, and harm. So what's the threat? What's the risk? What's the harm it's going to cause? And then how do we mitigate that? So that's that normal program manager blah speak. I think I was there only for about 8 months, and COVID came along. Now that was a really good opportunity because that allowed me to sort of shut the program down and rebuild it. And we built it on that principle of reducing harm to communities from cybercrime. So we've got 4 main areas we focus on. I think moving forward is we've got to narrow those areas down because we can't do everything. When you look at the funding that goes into Interpol, I think the budget we used to have in the UK for doing prepare work for law enforcement for cyber was about £40 million per annum. My budget at Interpol running a global program was about 1/10 of that. So I'll let the viewers work that out. So in terms of investment, I think first thing I'd say to countries is where do you make that investment where you're going to get a good return? Hopefully over the last 5 years, we've demonstrated that Interpol can implement on the cybercrime piece good programs of work which have an impact. But a lot of our work is funded through project funding. So we look at these cycles in countries. US is a good example. You're just coming through a new election. When I arrived at Interpol, you had one administration in, then another administration came in. So I could see those differences in the UK, in Europe, in some of the Far East countries. Now in Singapore, you had a very stable government there that invests over a period of time. So they will be looking 5 years ahead. In the Middle East, you have countries there looking 10, 15, 20, 50 years ahead. So how do we look at this over a longer time period and how do we fund into that? So one of the resources we're going to put in there, I think the challenge Interpol has, and will always have that challenge is, we have, to quote, you have nefarious countries within Interpol. Yeah, that's good because we've got them in the building. We've got all countries in the building. Just because you say that country is a nefarious country, that country might be saying you're a nefarious country. So get away from that side and look at the crime side of this. So how do we reduce that crime aspect? So understanding the threat and work in the private sector, we see some great work now with the private sector coming together. So you touched on it earlier around that competitive edge that private sector has. Well, the UN have introduced the ESG reporting. So this is the environmental, social and governance reporting. So companies have been made more aware, first of all, of what their social responsibilities are. So how do you invest? Do you invest in money? Do you invest in terms of data and information? So that's one example where companies are coming together now. And there's a piece of work we did for the World Economic Forum called Partnerships Against Cybercrime. It started off as a paper back in 2020. You've now got a number of leading cybersecurity companies coming together and working and looking at the four main threats, four organized crime groups behind those threats, and looking at the crossover points, and then pulling that data out and putting that into Interpol, and Interpol's then putting that into countries. So there's a good example, right, to think that can grow further. But then you need those operational desks, so making sure that you've got the connectivity between those countries. And it does come back to those person-to-person contacts.
Right.
You know, it's really hard. That trust model is really hard. You build it up over time. So, you know, the new director, Neil Jetton from US Secret Service, he's got some really great ideas that he's going to help build on some of the things that are already in place. But looking at the operational side of it is absolutely crucial, that operational coordination. Interpol's not going to be able to build in every country those capabilities and that capacity. And for me, there's a subtle difference between capability and capacity. We hear a lot about cyber capacity building, but what that means is, okay, what are you trying to build? So when I have a drink of water, the capability of that water, you know, quenches my thirst. If I had a whiskey, there'll be a different capability within that, wouldn't there? So identifying those capabilities and making sure that you can build those capabilities. But then on the capacity side of it, I'd say we need to build more capacity into that resiliency and that crime prevention side. But again, as Interpol, you're going into multiple jurisdictions, multiple countries. So you've got to have that cultural sensitivity about how you deliver that into those countries. And again, coming back to the private sector, being able to be that vehicle to help deliver that as well with governments and regional bodies. So looking at it through a regional lens, looking at it through a cybersecurity lens, and then looking at it through a national lens, and making sure you're doing that prevention piece and that detection piece first, because you can detect, then you can prevent. And then, yeah, you might do an investigation, but actually what does that investigation lead to at the end of the day? It might give some more information. Okay, well, you can build that back into prevention. And then the disruption bit, which you touched on there, is, you know, we do need to lock cyber criminals up. There has to be some consequences to their actions. And I think there was a Canadian that was arrested in Florida a couple of years ago. And the judge, in his summing up, said if he hadn't pled guilty, I mean, he was an affiliate for a ransomware syndicate. If he hadn't pleaded guilty, he would have got life. I think he got something like 18 or 20 years. That sent out a really, really strong message to the cyber criminals. Is that, folks, these are the consequences of your actions. And when you see your actions have consequences and you are going to get pulled up on those, you know, that again will make a difference. But I'd caveat all of this by, you know, we still have crime in that physical sense. I think in the technology sense for cybercrime, initially we thought we could design our way out of this and technologize our way out of this. We're not really going to be able to do that because we've got the people to factor into this as well. So again, how do we do that more effectively in the future is a challenge, not just for Interpol, but for our listeners here as well now. And coming back to my point, you know, a lot of this is about that creating communities to protect communities, having that common mission, having that common purpose effectively. I'm retiring, but I'm going to continue in that space for a little while longer.
There's a passion behind it. Obviously, it comes across. So, you know, Craig, first off, thank you so much for coming on and sharing more about the reality of what Interpol does in the cybercrimes program. Thank you for the great work that you've done over these past years in evolving the program, getting additional buy-in from all these different countries, which is, I can only imagine the feat involved behind getting them to collaborate, as we discussed. But also, you know, sharing some of the examples. I think it's critical for people to understand kind of the interconnection points of where Interpol is able to engage. And those examples you shared are great ways for people to better understand that. And then the last question I actually have for you in closing this out is, where can our listeners go to hear more, listen to, you know, some different conversations maybe you and the team have had, resources they can read, kind of what's that point? Because we'll definitely include that in our show notes as well.
Yeah, I think, you know, one thing I'd say is just search Interpol Cybercrime. We've got a whole section within that. But I'd also say look at nationally what's available as well. So on that national context, again, coming back to that, having the different cultural inferences within cybercrime, within prevention work is really, really important as well. They are quite nuanced. You will see some countries will take a more authoritative stance where they will block, they will just block services and things like that. Other countries don't so much. So I think what I've seen from sort of cybersecurity centers in countries, there's some fantastic advice coming out from there. But, is a CTO in a company might look at it, but a board probably wouldn't do. So how do we draw that? How do we make that realistic? One of the things I always like to say to sort of boards when I'm speaking to the boards is, okay, well, I'm sure you've got a really great procedure for how you deal with a cyber incident. You don't want to be pulling that out and using that in anger when you have that incident on a Friday night or a Saturday early hours of Saturday morning. You've got to run these drills like a fire drill. You've got to have these regular drills. You've got to build that into that company ethos, and it's got to start at the bottom and at the top and all points in between effectively.
Yeah, totally agree with you. And again, things like tabletop exercises, there's these great examples of, again, run through the different scenarios. To your point, don't do it while the fire is burning, right? So thank you so much again for all this information that you've been able to share with us. We truly appreciate it. Until next time, my friend, good luck on your new opportunities.
Thanks very much indeed, Rob. And thanks very much for everybody taking time to listen to this as well.
Hello, producer Ben here, and if you cast your mind back to the start of this episode, Rob said that cyber resilience was a subject close to his heart. Well, if you also feel that way, then there are plenty of editions of Reimagining Cyber that you need to be aware of, one being episode 5, called The Evolution from Cybersecurity to Cyber Resilience. It featured Ron Ross, computer scientist and a fellow at the National Institute of Standards and Technology.
Risk management is never about perfection. It's really about giving those senior leaders, those business managers, those leaders in those organizations, the best defenses possible and the best information so they can make credible risk-based decisions. It always is about the mission of the business. Sometimes you got to go with a little more risky operations because your risk tolerance may be a little bit greater. Sometimes you're more conservative, but that's kind of where all that is leading.
Thanks for listening to Reimagining Cyber. Now, I've got a challenge for you this week, and that is to share the show on your preferred social media using the hashtag Reimagining Cyber. If you do, we'll give you a mention on the podcast. What an honour. Goodbye.